Good afternoon and welcome to Reproaction's Act and Learn webinar for March 2022. Today's topic is extremely important and we're excited to have this conversation with you. This is an important conversation with you. It is about white supremacy and the anti-abortion movement. So first, we'll introduce your hosts. I will introduce myself first. I am Erin Matson. I use she, her pronouns. I am co-founder and executive director of Reproaction. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I am Erin to the Max on Twitter, and I encourage you to follow me there. And I'm stalling a little bit on purpose because Shireen is also troubleshooting audio for one of our panelists right now. Shireen, are you able to introduce yourself yet?
Yes, just got back in. We're all good. My name is Shireen Shakori. I use she and her pronouns, and I am Deputy Director here at Reproaction, also based in Washington, D.C.
Awesome. Thank you, Shireen, and a woman of many talents indeed. So we will start out with the agenda. So we'll introduce Reproaction. Then we'll have a discussion about the white supremacist roots of the anti-abortion movement and really make clear that these are one and the same movement. And then we'll move to a panel discussion. We're really excited to be joined by Ashley Whitaker from Texas Equal Access Fund, which is just doing heroic work funding abortions for Texans right now. Thank you, Texas Equal Access Fund and Ashley. And we're also really excited to welcome Danny Newsom from Cobalt Advocates, which does abortion access work in Colorado. So really excited to have our panelists joining us today. From there, we will move to next steps, and then we'll do Q&A. So a few housekeeping matters. Do you like to tweet? Do you want to tweet this stuff? That's great. Please use the hashtag Reproaction, and that way a bunch of folks can see it. Also, to proactively answer one of the most commonly asked questions, yes, we will be recording this webinar and we will send out a recording of the webinar. So know that that is coming. And finally, questions. There is no need to wait until the end of this presentation to ask your questions. Feel free to put those questions into the question tab at any time, whether you have questions for Ashley or Danny or Shireen or myself. You can put those into the questions tab and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. So with that, let's dive right in. So first, I'd like to introduce Reproaction. We lead bold action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We're fiercely proud of our left flank analysis, and we have a willingness to provide willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they're traditionally considered allies or opposition. And we have a deep commitment to nonviolent direct action as one of the tools in our toolbox. I noticed that a housekeeping question came in that I will answer right now. And the question is, are we able to provide captioning for this webinar? So we are currently, thank you so much for that question. Accessibility is extremely important to work for reproductive justice. And we are working to troubleshoot that right now. That is an ongoing conversation. We're hopeful that that by the next webinar or two, we'll have that up and running. But what we can pledge to you right now is that everything that's on the screen, we will read out. So anyone who is listening should be able to have a full experience, regardless of whether or not they have access to screen readers. Thank you for that question. All right, and also our recorded version that we will be sharing out is captioned, so thank you for that. All right, so let's talk about white supremacy and anti-abortion, because it's actually, these are not two conversations. White supremacy and anti-abortion are actually the same conversation. And one of the things that we want to do with this webinar today is not just give you information. There's been an explosion of interest in the linkages between white supremacy and the anti-abortion movement, particularly after January 6th. When a number of known anti-abortion activists were part of the melee that ultimately led to the white supremacist coup attempt at the US Capitol to overturn the election in favor of keeping Donald Trump in power. And it's become very clear that not only is there a lot of interest in this topic, but also that people, even if they instinctively get it, they don't really know how to talk about it. And I want to ask first, have you ever heard someone say the anti-abortion movement is racist and wondered, well, why are they racist? Or what is racist about them? Or thought to yourself, I know that they're racist, but how can I help explain this to my family, friend, or colleague who might not get it? And I want to say, at the outset, it's true that the pro-life movement is rooted in some conservatives growing increasingly uncomfortable with expressing outright support for segregationism, that is where our modern anti-abortion movement came from, and that they needed a new political wedge issue. We'll cover that, and Shireen will cover that in detail shortly. And it's also 100% true that the pro-life movement is very comfortable with overt and implied racism in their tent, meaning in their actions, in their campaigns, in their slogans, and that there is widespread harm inflicted on people of color as a result of their anti-abortion hatred and laws. And we will cover that too. We know that they know it, and we know that they don't care. But I want to provide a framework for those of you who may be thinking about, how do I talk about this more effectively with my aunt or my friend, and take a step back first. So let's cover 3 topics that are actually quite interconnected. White supremacy, gender roles, and reproductive oppression. They need one another to survive. None of them can survive on their own. White supremacy. So what is white supremacy? At a very simple definition, white supremacy is the belief that white people are superior and should dominate society at the expense of other racial and ethnic groups. And I want to be very clear that white supremacy is disgusting, it hurts people, it's wrong, and we must undo it. It is in our strategic plan at Reproaction, we identify that dismantling white supremacy and racial justice is the most urgent issue everywhere, including in our work. Secondly, gender roles. What are gender roles? Those are the social and cultural roles associated with masculinity and femininity. It is completely separate from biological sex, though they are often conflated. And conflating sex and gender can cause grave harm to transgender and gender nonconforming people. And regardless, even for cisgender individuals, conflating biological sex and gender roles is just total poppycock, and it hurts people. There is, to put it very simply, if you've ever heard of like gender reveal parties when a person is pregnant, that's not possible to reveal someone's gender. A gender is inherent to a person, and it is not tied to biology. Finally, let's talk about reproductive oppression. And here I want to directly quote some wonderful leaders in the field: Crystal M. Hayes, Master of Social Works, Carolyn Sufrin, a doctor and PhD, and Dr. Jamila Parrott, a doctor and Master's in Public Health. And Dr. Jamila Parrott is actually the head of Physicians for Reproductive Health. This is a direct quote from an article they wrote for the American Journal of Public Health called "Reproductive Justice Disrupted: Mass Incarceration as a Driver of Reproductive Oppression." And it's really just a very succinct and powerful definition of reproductive oppression. It is the regulation of individuals' bodies, sexuality, labor, and procreative strategies as a strategy to control individuals and entire communities. So again, I want to underscore that these things need one another to survive: white supremacy, gender roles, reproductive oppression. Think of like, those little lights that are used either alternately for holidays, or some people use them on porches, where it's a circuit. They need one another to survive. If one burns out, the others are in trouble. So that brings us back to pro-life and their racism, controlling gender, sexuality, and reproduction. Let's be very clear. White supremacy requires an ongoing supply of white babies and subservient, albeit privileged, I want to acknowledge that, white women to birth them, while publicly proclaiming life and even trying to co-opt anti-racist language. The pro-life perspective cares nothing for people of color, LGBTQ people, and people experiencing poverty who are most criminalized and harmed by abortion bans, as well as laws restricting pregnancy and sexuality. And so just to be very clear, white supremacy in action necessarily includes, you cannot have white supremacy in action without enforcing strict gender roles, which is big pro-life to a T, without controlling sexuality, which is big pro-life to a T, and without seizing control of the means of reproduction. So please, next time you hear someone say these issues are different, please fight back. It's all interconnected. Racial justice, gender equality, sexual freedom, LGBTQ equality, and a special love for trans youth who are experiencing so much harm at the hands of hateful politicians, and being proudly pro-abortion. And I'll just close and pass it to Shireen, who's going to really dive deep. I'm very excited for her presentation. That Big Pro-Life has absolutely no trouble understanding the interconnection of these issues, and it's high time all advocates for justice did the same. Thank you, and I will pass it to Shireen.
Yes, thank you so much, Erin. So we see thematically and on the big 10,000-foot level how these issues are connected, but digging into some of the granular history, we know that anti-abortion views were more at their root held by Catholics, way back in the day, which made them kind of unpalatable to the folks of the denominations that now kind of take up the charge of the broader pro-life movement. Fears of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants being demographically overtaken by Catholic, Irish, and Italian immigrants is what fueled an interest in increasing those white Protestant birth rates, as well as targeting of Catholics by KKK and other white supremacist groups. But then as rising immigration came from other parts of the world like Latin America and Asia, the goalposts of whiteness were shifted, and I should say they were shifted always in a manner that put anti-Blackness at the core of that shift. And they welcomed in white Catholics who were increasingly less othered in the public square, considered a more assimilated group of immigrants, and that was all done to help reassert demographic control based on whiteness. At the same time, Jewish people were replacing Catholics as the white targets of the KKK and other white supremacist groups, while white evangelical and Baptist organizations still largely supported abortion rights or were just ambivalent at these decisions.
Oh, Shireen, we lost you right after ambivalent. Can you hear me? Shireen, can you hear me? One moment, she will be right back. Let me, let's just give her a moment. Okay, next slide. Shireen, we can't hear you. Your audio cut out.
Yes, okay, am I back?
You're back, and you were just at the end of that slide, so you are good to go on.
Yep, I asked for next slide and then I cut out. But so what happened was that the anti-abortion movement was born out of white conservatives trying to respond to desegregation of schools and just broader public life. I highly, highly encourage folks to read the writings of Alex DeBranco and Richard Ballmer that I cite at the bottom, any of the sources that we cited, because they have a lot more really interesting granular detail. But basically, they write about this insistence that the IRS was, at the time of school desegregation, trying to rescind the tax-exempt status of schools that were Christian-based but racially discriminating, including having bans on interracial dating until 2000, so the year definitely most of us were alive in this time. And these groups were the architects of the religious right. And they kind of found abortion opposition as a way to unify folks in a way that didn't sound as publicly unpalatable as saying we are opposing desegregation of schools and public places. So after years of trying to court white evangelicals to conservative political action, the promise of upholding segregation and maintaining their coffers to do so, keeping that tax-exempt status, was the organizing force that these radical right folks needed. The goal was kind of shrouded in the trappings of this new moral movement, which is why you see the rise of places like Moral Majority, Heritage Foundation, all these groups that kind of wave the banner of we're the moralizing sources in this country, kind of the moral compass. They're actually a cloak for racist ends. The logic was that they needed to maintain their own Christian schools in order to uphold the teaching and their religious values, thus weaponizing the concept of freedom of religion and free speech to enshrine their segregation attempts. Next slide, please. Awesome. Now, next is the racist violence that ensued. The response to radical racist anti-abortion activists not finding their goals met by these religious right leaders, because, you know, the folks who were actually anti-abortion were getting lip service, but not the actual anti-abortion action they wanted, chose to seek out increasingly violent tactics. And you can find some really good writing of the period on this, particularly Loretta Ross's writings from the 90s about how early skinhead organizing, neo-Nazis in the 80s and 90s, in cooperation with KKK and other groups, were the core of anti-abortion organizing. You saw a huge response of Holocaust rhetoric. That's also imagery, like very blatant use of swastikas or swastika-like designs and neo-Nazi talking points to both cast doubt on the actual Jewish Holocaust and also demonize abortion providers in a way that made them akin to the Nazis that they were actually embodying themselves in this far-right organizing. And then I include this quote from Alex DeBranco. In 1985, the KKK began creating wanted posters listing personal information for abortion providers. Randall Terry, founder of the anti-choice group Operation Rescue, and John Burt, regional director of anti-abortion group Rescue America in the 90s, targeted Dr. David Gunn, who was murdered in 93 in Pensacola, Florida. Gunn's successor, Dr. John Britton, targeted by Rescue America by a wanted poster, was killed in 94, and the Florida-based KKK organized a rally in support of Dr. Britton's killer, and the founder of a racist group, White Aryan Resistance, condoned it for the protection of Aryan women and children. Next slide, please. So if you hadn't listened to the previous discussion that Erin laid out, you might wonder why these groups with potentially different end games might conflate on the same radical violent organizing, and a lot of it goes back to replacement theory. Like Erin said, white supremacy is sustained through a ready supply of white babies, and the through line between the anti-abortion movement's organizing rhetoric is about combating what they perceive as demographic shifts that oppose their hold on power. So from early Catholics to later non-white immigrants, the primary concern was maintaining racialized control, which meant forcing white Christian women to bear more children and prop up the desired white ethno-state, and punishing people of color for their birth rates through criminalization, enforced poverty, and inhumane immigration restrictions. So it's really no wonder that modern white nationalist figures and groups have found a very comfortable home in the pro-life movement, from recently seeing Patriot Front marching alongside the March for Life in multiple cities, to the anti-abortion group New Wave Feminists' former president being outed as a white nationalist, to pro-life priest Frank Pavone proclaiming that there is, quote, nothing wrong with being white and nothing wrong with being a nationalist. You see it everywhere. Some of them are just more willing to say it out loud. And with that, pro-life white nationalism is unfortunately on the rise. It never went to bed, but like I said, they are more willing to be loud about it. The contemporary anti-abortion movement has at times tried to distance themselves from their violence with a softer image, but when the Trump administration took power, they were rewarded with anti-abortion, anti-gay, racist, sexist policy promises. But this evil existed before Trump and continues to persist. Reproductive control is inherently racist, and it traces its legacy to slavery within our borders and beyond. Control over a person or group's fertility, pregnancy outcomes, childbearing, or child rearing cannot be discussed outside of a racial context. Racism is the core issue, and it should be the primary concern for feminists in this work. And so I'm really excited to introduce two feminists in this work, very much in the work and doing great things. So I'll kick it over to Erin for our first panelist intro.
Thank you so much, Shireen. That was comprehensive and just deeply upsetting. And I'm glad that our listeners are getting that information. So first, I'm very excited to introduce Ashley Whitaker. Ashley uses she, her pronouns and lives in Texas and is co-president of the T-Fund Board, president of the Pegasus Health Justice Board, and secretary of the Avow Texas Board. She was inspired to get involved with abortion rights activism by Wendy Davis's epic filibuster in 2013. When not goofing around on social media, Ashley enjoys crafting, baking, and standing Beyonce. Ashley, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for the extremely important work that you are doing in Texas. Thank you, thank you. Oh, Shireen, can you unmute yourself? I believe Ashley's connected through you. Sorry for these technical difficulties. All right, you know what I'm gonna
You're not at the moment.
Not on at the moment? Okay.
No, I thought I did.
How about this? Shireen, why don't you grab Ashley? What I will do is I will switch us to Danny. I will, since you'll be.
Oh, I have Ashley now. If
you have Ashley. Okay.
Actually,
great.
I'll switch to Danny because yeah, sorry.
I'll do questions with Danny, and then we'll go back to Ashley, and you can do Ashley's questions. Sound good? Cool. Okay. Thank you to everyone for. So I'm very pleased as well to introduce Danny Newsom, who uses she, her pronouns. Danny is the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Cobalt, a reproductive rights advocacy organization. Prior to Cobalt, she managed the ACLU of Colorado's education and outreach efforts, education and communication at the Gay, Lesbian, and Bisexual Community Center of Colorado, and communications and training at the Chinook Fund. Earlier in her career, Danny, an attorney, directed the City of Boulder's Human Rights Office and served as an Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights and Labor in the Colorado Attorney General's Office. She also has a Master of Arts in U.S. History and has taught American history at the University of Colorado Denver campus, Metropolitan State University Denver, and the Community College of Aurora. Danny, are you there and can you hear me? Welcome. Oh. Welcome, Danny. So great to have you.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if you could hear me, but I think we're set to go, right?
We are set to go, and I'm so excited to hear from you on this serious topic. So your state, Colorado, has recently experienced an incursion of white supremacist, extreme anti-abortion figures organizing in opposition to an abortion rights bill. Could you explain for our listeners what's been happening and what you've seen on the ground?
Well, yeah, and thanks for having me. I should say, thank you very much. Yeah, this is notwithstanding everything that's going on in the world and in the United States and the constant attacks, mental and physical, on abortion rights and abortion access and abortion justice supporters. In Colorado, for this moment, we are excited. The Colorado State House and the Colorado State Senate have approved the Reproductive Health Equity Act. And our governor, Jared Polis, will be signing it sometime within the next week. And so that's absolutely major. But what happened, I mean, what's always happened, 2 years ago, the anti-abortion cabal in Colorado, and actually outside of Colorado, put a ballot measure on the November ballot 2020 that, if it had passed, would have banned abortions after 22 weeks. So abortions later in pregnancy. we knew this was going to be a tough fight, and we went into it thinking it was going to be a very, very tough fight and a close vote. But as it turned out, that measure lost by almost 19 points in Colorado. So not only did you have Democrats, independents, you had a lot of Republicans voting no. So it's really clear in Colorado that abortion rights, abortion access is a Colorado value. But that hasn't stopped the other side. And what the other side does is they use racialized language. They actually, I mean, they're appropriating feminist language, they're appropriating language of racial justice, all in defense, actually, of the accusations, not just the accusations, the ties we know that are in the anti-abortion movement, white supremacist and anti-abortion movement. So they're using this language. I have I just want to read you something from, it's called, quote, Life Decisions, close quote, and what their messaging was on the Reproductive Health Equity Act. They said the act, quote, targets people of color and people with low incomes to achieve racial equity. This bill tells women, especially poor Latino and Black women, that they are incapable to succeed without ending the lives of their babies. This bill is the fulfillment of the founder of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger, who wanted to exterminate minorities, blah, blah, blah. So you see the argument they make. They make that they allege that abortion itself is racist. And what they do in doing that is really perpetuate this idea that women of color, and it's particularly women, they don't single out pregnant people, they single out women, and Black and Latina women at that, as being incapable of any agency on their own behalf, that they are not able to advocate for themselves and determine what the hell is best for their own lives, but rather that Black and Latino women are being led to the slaughter, so to speak, by abortion providers. And so it is sick. It's a lie, obviously, but it is sick. But it's what they're doing and what they do, because in defense of the very real connection between white supremacy, white supremacists, and the anti-abortion movement. I think I gave you a lot of background. I don't know if I answered your question, though.
No, you did answer my question. And
I don't know. I wanted to add that testifying at the State House and State Senate, the anti-abortion folks essentially filibustered the State House, but pro-abortion rights Democrats actually control have the majority in the State House and in the State Senate. So it was a foregone conclusion that with a lot of work and getting some folks on board who might have been a bit concerned because they come from more competitive districts, it was a foregone conclusion that RIA would pass, right? But you would not believe, well, you would believe the men, and it was white men that dominated the anti-abortion witnesses. And we made jokes, kind of uncomfortable jokes, that when you looked around the hearing room, it's like we had seen these people at the January 6th insurrection. So not necessarily these exact people, but it was the look. And one of the people who testified at the State House was Jeff Durbin, who said that night, and who has said before, that women who get abortions should be executed. So this was just really sick, vile, and violent rhetoric that we listened to.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Danny. And just a few things to lift up as I'm before I move to this next question, first, I just want to congratulate you on this incredible victory of expecting the expansion in access to abortion in Colorado, and how important that is for people in Colorado, as well as for people regionally that may be coming into Colorado for care because their states and increasingly our federal government is failing us in making sure that everyone has access to care in their own communities. I also just want to
Thank you.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I also just am lifting up a couple things that you said. One, the preponderance of white men that were making
Yes.
they're testifying. I mean, there's no question that's not an accident, right? And it is.
No, it isn't.
Reality. Yeah, right. Because that's who benefits from this is white men. This is all about white male dominance, right? So just really appreciate you lifting that up, and also their co-opting of language, and also, you know, noting the difference between the fact that abortion access is it's pregnant people and people with capacity for pregnancy who are targeted, and yet the antis are talking all about women, and that's not an accident either, because
No.
as you covered, it's about a regressive forcing gender roles as part of serving white supremacy. So
Absolutely.
I want to ask another question. So I mean, there's no question that that reactionaries and the right wing are using racism as a tool to achieve their policy goals. And in fact, at the same time, the policy goals in themselves are about cementing racism. Could you talk a little bit about how Colorado abortion access and reproductive justice advocates have been combating the racist myths that the anti-abortion movement and their broader right wing have been spewing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one way, it hasn't been, I don't think it's been terribly well organized in Colorado. The racist attacks on abortion rights and abortion access and abortion justice, but nevertheless, it's here. And so one way we've been combating that is to really center the lives of women of color and people of color who can get pregnant, is to do that, because the abortion rights movement has its own problem with not having done that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it has its own darn problem. So that has been helpful. And I'd like to actually say, looking at the Reproductive Health Equity Act, it does more than guarantee the right to abortion as a fundamental right in Colorado. It also guarantees the right to use or refuse contraception, to continue a pregnancy, you know, fate willing, and to give birth, or to obtain an abortion. And so it is more than an abortion protective legislation. It certainly does that, but it also enshrines the other aspects, some other aspects of reproductive reality as fundamental rights. And that's important because historically it is women of color, Black women, First Nations women, Latinx women, and poor women of all colors who have been subject to sterilization, to violent sterilization, to criminalized pregnancy, criminalized outcomes of pregnancy. And so I think that was very important. And so the legislation itself included more than abortion protective language to at least acknowledge in some way the histories, the very different histories that Black women, Latinx women, First Nations women, and other people who can get pregnant of color, what our experience and what our historical experiences have been. And then as far as the people who show up at the hearings, or the people who show up in very public ways to promote anti-abortion legislation. In fact, in Colorado, since 2028, there have been 4 abortion bans and or restrictions that have been on the statewide ballot, and they've been roundly defeated, but they just keep coming back. To combat that, it's more a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And Danny, I want to congratulate you again on this incredible achievement with the Reproductive Health Equity Act, and also thank you and applaud you for naming that that advocates for gender equality and for abortion access have long had their own problems, as you named.
Yes.
With white supremacy. And it's time to own that, everyone. It's 2022. Are we going to win or are we going to lose? Are we going to be for justice, or are we going to be picking up old postcards from the 60s and advocating for something that was not inclusive all along? And so I really appreciate that.
Well said.
And Danny, this has been spectacular. I know folks have questions for you. I'm going to please put those in the questions tab. And we'll get to as many as we can at the end. I'm going to pass it back to Shireen to do Q&A with Ashley.
Okay, I should have Ashley on now. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hell yes. Okay, great. Thank you so much for joining us. Sorry again, everyone, about our sound difficulties and connection issues. But we have the illustrious Ashley Whitaker here. She uses she, her pronouns, lives in Texas, and is co-president of the Texas Equal Access Fund Board, president of the Pegasus Health Justice Board, and secretary of the Avow Texas Board. She was inspired to get involved with abortion rights activism by Wendy Davis's epic filibuster in 2013. When not goofing around on social media, Ashley enjoys crafting, baking, and standing Beyonce. Thank you again for joining us, Ashley.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. So as you allude to in your bio, you are a master of shutting up racist trolls on social media, which is really fun to watch, but it's also super important since, as you know, so much of abortion fundraising is happening online. So what tips do you have for getting the work done through the noise and the threats of white supremacists?
I would say, so my overall vibe in life is very much, it is what it is. And other people might be more optimistic to me, and definitely more power to them. But I'm kind of the perspective that white supremacy, unfortunately, isn't going to go anywhere until the majority of white people make an active, conscious decision to be anti-racist. And I unfortunately don't see that happening in my lifetime. So that being said, since they're not going anywhere, I really kind of choose to direct my energy
Shireen and Ashley, we lost you again. One moment. One moment. Sorry for all these technical difficulties, folks. We'll get that figured out right away so we can get back to Ashley and Shireen. You know what? While we wait for them, because we will get them back, I am confident we will figure this out. I'm going to take care of a little more housekeeping, and Shireen can just indicate when she's back with Ashley. So want to encourage folks to sign up for our alerts at reproaction.org and to follow us on social media. We are Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And also to please save the date for our next webinar, which is substance use and pregnancy. will be our topic, and that'll be on Thursday, April 28th at 12:30 Eastern. So let me see if I can grab Shireen and Ashley back. One moment. Sorry about this, everyone. All right. Well, while we wait for them to come back, Danny, let's take a couple questions in from the audience, and I really apologize. We are having a lot of challenges. Danny, can you do some Q&A now while we wait for Ashley and Shireen to come back?
Yes, I can. Not to worry.
Thank you so much. So here's a question from Julia. It says, how does one deal with the statements about making access to reproductive services available is, quote, genocide, unquote, for people of color?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I don't know if you remember a really, oh my God, just outrageous incident that happened in New York. I forget which borough, but the forced birthers, I call them, because they're certainly not pro-life, had put up a huge billboard and appropriated the images of a Black woman, an adult Black woman, and a young, adorable Black girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old. And with the, I'm paraphrasing here, but saying with the text that abortion was the greatest threat to Black children's lives in America. And they put it up in some borough. They actually were forced to take it down since they hadn't gotten the legal permission from either the woman whose image was used or the parent of the young child whose image was used. Just absolutely outrageous. And what you do is you have to take it straight on. I wrote an op-ed in response to an op-ed that a person from Colorado Christian University, that tells you all you want to know, had written, likening abortion to enslavement.
Mm.
And I, in my op-ed, I said, actually, the Jeff Hunter was his name. Hunter was actually just really imitative of the enslavers of old, ignoring the agency, the humanity of Black people, of Black women and other Black people who can give birth, and using their bodies only for his own purposes, which for his purposes was to argue for forced birth. And so you just have to meet it head on. You have to meet it head on. I don't think it's enough to be defensive and say we're not racist. It's you have to call it out, So I likened him to the enslavers of old, and accused him, rightly, I believe, of using Black bodies for his own purposes.
Thank you.
Call it out.
Thank you for that, Danny. It is so important to call it out. And I think we've got Shireen and Ashley back, so I will pass it back to them, and then we'll do more Q&A at the end. Thank you.
We do. I'm sorry, y'all. We keep getting kicked off by this platform. But yeah, Ashley, if you want to just start again from the top of that last question when you were saying about folks expecting struggle, I think is where we got.
Oh, yeah. So, like I said, I think that a lot of Black people have an expectation that it's supposed to be a struggle just based off of what we've seen historically of the Black experience in relation to white supremacy. So I think that because of that, for some Black people, when they experience an unintended or a mistimed pregnancy, they may not even consider accessing abortion care, sidebar, assuming it's even accessible, which is a whole nother conversation for another day. But they may not even consider getting an abortion because they have that I don't know if it's unconscious or conscious or not, but that belief that, oh, well, it's going to be hard, but, my parents did it, my grandparents did it, I can do it too. And I think it's important to remind people, especially Black people, that, no, life doesn't have to be hard. Like, it doesn't have to be a struggle. It's okay to be selfish and think of yourself. It's okay to not want to go through life with, struggling to put food on the table for your family. Like, that's okay. And I think that's something that, that's a way that racism shows up quietly that probably doesn't get explored or talked about enough.
I think that's a really beautiful sentiment, that folks can feel conditioned to struggle, and that you can take that back for yourself and for your family and chosen family and community. Thank you for that. Last up on our prepared questions, what have you found most helpful to beat back against white supremacist rhetoric while also holding space for your own safety and self-care?
So I had a revelation, an epiphany, whatever you want to call it, a while back, that most people on the internet, not all, but most of them have no clue what they're talking about. And I think that's especially applicable when it comes to subjects like race, gender, sexuality, and definitely abortion. So I remember when I first joined Twitter, I actually did try to have conversations with people, and I would get frustrated because I'm coming to the discussion with, facts and history on my side and blah, 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 blah. But in a lot of ways, it was like talking to a brick wall because, again, most people really don't know what they're talking about. And again, especially when it comes to abortion. So with that in mind, for my own self-care, when I do engage with antis, I don't do so from a sincere place. By that, I mean, I'm going to crack jokes at their expense for my entertainment and for the entertainment of the people that follow me. So, for example, a few weeks ago, there was an account that I came across where it was this guy who was anti-abortion, but also an anarchist. And I was like, this math does not math, because if there's no state and there's no authority, who is keeping people from getting abortions? How does that work? What does that mean? And do you know what anarchy means? And I remember those tweets got some good traction in pro-abortion Twitter, because again, this doesn't make sense. What are you talking about? So yeah, again, like I said, it's mostly, I'm not engaging with them seriously because, like I said, they don't know what they're talking about. I'm not going to change your mind. You're not going to change my mind. So I might as well get these jokes off. And then also, I feel a lot of time that people they're looking for a debate and feel entitled to one for whatever reason. So not giving them that, I find that particularly satisfying. Not giving them what I know they want. So that's kind of my own little way of self-care on the internet and dealing with them is, again, like I said, I'm going to get these jokes off, and I'm going to deny you the serious, intellectual debate that you want so badly.
Absolutely. And I love that example. That was quite a hoot online for those who were able to participate. So thank you for that. And thank you and everyone for your patience with our tech difficulties. But I think we made it happen. So I'll kick it back to Erin for Q&A and to close us out.
Thank you so much, Shireen, and thank you, Ashley, and thank you, everyone. As a special shout out to Shireen and Ashley for moving through the tech difficulties, but everyone else as well. Okay, so let's do some questions. We've got more coming in. First, I'm going to, I want to share a comment from one of our listeners that's really great, who wanted to clarify that white Jewish people replace Catholics as the white targets on an earlier slide, to acknowledge that there are Jewish people of color. And thank you so much for that comment. That's spot on. And another question, just to confirm that we will be sending out a recording of this webinar. So let's start with Ashley for another question that's come in. Stacy is asking, to hear your thoughts on the racist origins of the Hyde Amendment. So let's start with Ashley. If you could explain what the Hyde Amendment is, and then also the racism that got it all started.
So the Hyde Amendment, basically, I'm pretty sure he was a congressman. I don't know his first name, but the last name is Hyde. Obviously, that's where the name comes from. But basically, the Hyde Amendment stipulates that federal funds can't be used to pay for abortions, and so Medicaid recipients, outside of, I think, a situation of assault or the pregnant person's life is in danger. I think those are the two exceptions, if I recall correctly. Outside of those, Medicaid funds can't be used to access an abortion. And here in Texas, we actually tried to get legislation passed that would allow that in the name of Rosie Jimenez, who is the first person who passed away that we know of as a result of the Hyde Amendment. She lived, I believe, in the valley near the border, and because she couldn't access an abortion, she went to Mexico and unfortunately succumbed to that. So if I recall correctly, too, the racist origin of that was that the congressperson, Congressman Hyde, he said, if I recall correctly, that he wanted to keep Black people from accessing abortion. I'm fuzzy on the history of it and the specificity of him, but I know that there definitely was some racist rhetoric around the Hyde Amendment and its application and a desire to prevent people from accessing abortion, especially people of color.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll just share. So his first name, it's Henry Hyde, and yes, you're absolutely right that what he said was that he wanted to prevent anyone from being able to access abortion, but he was going to start with poor women, and that is and it was clearly racially targeted. So thank you for that, Ashley. That was a great answer and really helpful. Danny, is there anything else you'd like to add from your perspective on the Hyde Amendment and racism?
No, other than that his name indeed was Henry. And I had read that he had offhandedly, I wish, sources are important, and I wish I could remember the source, but it was fairly recently, that Henry Hyde had said, well, it's only going to affect Black women. And this was in answer to someone who had expressed concerns about his proposed amendment, and so there was a racist dismissal of the lives of Black women in everything that he said. Oh, it's only going to affect Black women. And I do wish that I could give you the source. But once again, it's another example of an attempt, even if it's offhand. And I mean, white supremacists now feel free to talk, but and spew, because we've had a president who encouraged them, and so he didn't create them, he just encouraged them to come out. But there was a time when they did have to be more circumspect. And so even though that Henry Hyde's comment was an offhand comment, I mean, this is something that you could imagine white men, and this was back in the 1970s or 1980s, that white men would be saying in the corridors, or just in their own private moments with each other. It's just going to affect Black women, but it's also part of a long, unbroken history of the regulation of the reproductive lives of women of color.
Thank you for that, Danny. So we have another question in that let's start with Danny on this one. What have you found is an effective way to talk to legislators who might be on the fence about understanding the link between white supremacy and anti-choice?
I'm sorry, could you give me that question again?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So thinking about legislators, what have you, legislators who are on the fence about the link between anti-abortion and white supremacy, what have you found as an effective way to talk to them to help show them the linkages between the two?
You know, that's a good question, but first I would say, I would ask what your goal is. What is your goal? This may sound odd, but if your goal is to get a vote, right? To get support, we actually have to be strategic. That's not always necessary. I mean, I hate to say this, but in 2022, when we have so many battles in front of us, if there is a legislator who is, for whatever reason, who needs to be persuaded either to support proactive legislation or oppose abortion restrictions or abortion bans, it's important to look at that as the ultimate goal, and to use whatever arguments and whatever information, I mean, truthfully, but whatever is necessary to get that desired result. Now, for somebody who is, for a legislator who is ignorant, but is still open to that information, I think it's important not to overwhelm that person, with information. I think it's important to lay a foundation, and to do a comparison. And again, that's if this person is open, and to do a comparison. Look at the America First, the race suicide language from 110 years ago, language that former President Teddy Roosevelt even used in their argument that middle class and middle income, I should say, and upper income white women needed to have more babies. This was their argument against birth control. They certainly didn't care about the lives of people of color. It was white women and middle income and upper income women in particular. It is so important to look at that, and then you can make a tie. You can compare the language that is used now, whether it's replacement theory or what have you, the direct tie between racism, white supremacy, and reproduction. Whatever they're arguing for, the tie is there. You see it in the language, but it's a good way to lay a foundation. You know, I mean, some things are not new. They just have, they might use different words, different phrases, but they're not new. And there is a direct tie between the race suicide language and ideology of 100 years ago or so, and the arguments that the white supremacist anti-abortion faction is making now. And again, that I think is for somebody who may be ignorant, just may not be aware, but is certainly open to learning.
Thank you so much.
I'm saying, like, I think it's important to pick your battle, bottom line. I used a lot of words to get around to say pick your battle.
Thank you so much, Danny. We are just at time, but I've got about 30 seconds or less. Ashley, I want to give you an opportunity. If there's anything else you would like to share, we're so glad you joined us today through all the technical hiccups. Is there anything else you want to share, Ashley? Okay. All right, well, with that, I'm going to close this webinar. Thank you to our fabulous panelists, Ashley Whitaker and Danny Newsome. This has been just a very thought-provoking and important panel, and a special thank you to Reproaction Deputy Director Shireen Shakori for pulling together this absolutely important and urgent webinar. Thank you to everyone, and we'll see you again next month to discuss drug use and pregnancy. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you.